This Crooks, I introduce you all know me from this morning. This Crooks is our finance specialist at Dell, works for Dell Financial Services. I'm going to press some buttons here. Some of the slides I created, you'll know from the pictures, but it's all about what Liz is going to tell us about financing options at school, and some interesting stuff. Leave it to you, Liz.
Yep. So I want this to be quite an interactive session, so interrupt at any time if anything I've said is not enough or not clear to you, because I'll just waffle on and it'll be boring. So just to sort of give a bit of an overview, whilst I am Dell Financial Services, I'm not here to tell you that leasing is the only solution, but what I'm seeing from schools all over at the moment is, you know, we had funding from the government, the funding's drying up. How are we going to maintain IT solutions for the kids going forward, whether that be one-to-one or anything else? So when we sort of look at these options up here on the board, we've got the pros and cons of different types of options that are available, and I think you've already heard enough today spoken about, you know, whether it be BYO device or school provided devices, the pros and cons there. So I'm not going to repeat that for you, bore you to tears. We're going to sort of move on to the details of what I've seen as being successful in those schools that have one-to-one programs around the place, and the programs that have been really, really successful really involved the parent community, taking it out to the parent community, telling them in advance, this is what we plan to do, this is how it's going to happen.
Please stand by for the following announcement.
These are the costs associated with it, and so on and so forth. So really early involvement of the parent community has been one of the, probably the most important reasons for the success of the program going forward. And that's in the school environments where they're asking the parents to contribute to the cost of the units. Okay, so just to clarify there. Quite often by the time as the school comes to me to talk about leasing options, because let's face it, when they talk to me, they're talking about leasing, they've already made a decision to investigate it. A lot of schools have still not faced the fundamentals of what their program is going to deliver. And I guess one of the messages here is leasing is not going to change a whole heap of business decisions that ultimately lie with the school, not with the finance company. And by that, what I'm trying to get at is the school will come to me and say, well, what happens if the device is lost or stolen? Well, it doesn't make any difference whether it's an owned device or a leased device. If it's lost or stolen, you're going to, if it's stolen, it's going to be probably a police report or an insurance claim and whatever's associated with an insurance claim. So leasing doesn't change the parameter there. What happens if a child leaves the school midterm during the life of that product? What would have happened had the school owned that device? It's not a leasing decision. It comes back to schools having the business fundamentals drawn up about how they're going to manage their program, whether leasing's involved or not. Gee, you changed the slides really quickly.
Oh, did you? Oh, sorry, you're still going on that one. Sorry.
Well, the other thing that comes into account with a lot of the schools is it's going to be really easy for a school where the majority of parents can afford to just go out and purchase the device. You can just say, okay, everybody go out and buy this device, and that sort of takes the onus off the school. But let's face it, the majority of schools are going to have a percentage of students that come from families that are not able to go out and pay cash for that equipment. And depending on what that percentage is, there needs to be some sort of, I guess, plan for what you do for the exceptions. What we also have is schools that say, well, you know, if you can't afford to pay cash, you could probably put it on a credit card or go to GE Money or get a consumer finance solution. But the people least able to afford to pay for those goods up front, put it on a credit card, will end up applying for credit and possibly being rejected for that credit application for consumer finance. And there are problems, you know, this is a little can of worms that I'm trying to sort of talk to you about. The can of worms is if they can't pay up front for the goods, if they're being rejected for credit, how does that family feel about your IT program now? Because they've just been alienated, and some of them are big enough to sort of come in and say, I have financial problems, and some of them are going to be too proud. So the solution needs to be something that deals with whatever percentage of your community. And if it's small, you can probably absorb it. But if you've got a large percentage of your community that are unable to access the funding to procure a device and fund for it fully themselves in that first year, there needs to be consideration to that group. I'll talk through a little bit more about that, but if you've got questions, you can flick the page now. So that's where we sort of talk about these leasing options. If you have made a decision that the school is unable to fund a program and you are going to explore leasing, you can choose the consumer finance model where the parent is the one that signs that lease agreement, or you can choose a business finance model where the school signs a lease agreement and then effectively allows the students to use that equipment through an IT access fee or a sub-lease agreement. My recommendation is you choose an IT access fee, because that implies to the parents that what they're paying for is for their child to have access to a device and an infrastructure that supports the device. And it doesn't sort of tie that parent down to this sort of feeling that I'm paying for it and so therefore I should own it, and if I leave the school I'm going to take it with me. Right? It's all in the presentation to the families and to the parents. Another problem with the parent lease model is the terms and conditions, and I will get a little bit further into terms and conditions later in the presentation, because risk adversity is something that principals and business managers all need to be aware of when it comes to leasing. Of course, there's two different types of leases: a finance lease, which technically government schools should not be signing a finance lease, and there's a rental, which is also known as an operating lease or a fair market value lease. Now, what's really interesting here is there's some accounting terminology that may be boring to you, but if an operating lease is set up where there's a bargain purchase option at the end, technically it's a finance lease. But, you know, really every school is going to come up with their own reason for which lease they choose. I have government schools that sign finance leases, others that sign rental agreements, and others that sign rental agreements that have a capped purchase price, so that there's no surprises if you purchase the goods at the end of the lease. Yes?
You mentioned that when if you go with the leasing option, that some of the payment is to be done by the parents. What have other schools used as their model for pricing that you charge the parents for the usage of the ICT?
Yeah, and everyone's approaching it from a different angle. The Newcomb Secondary College last year did a co-contribution model where the school paid a percentage and the parents were asked to pay a percentage. Now, very, very low socioeconomic demographics, so they couldn't, whilst some of the parents could pay the entire year in advance, others are paying on a monthly basis, and they have Compass School Manager, and Compass School Manager allows for the parents to come up and feed cash into the machine, and they can sort of see how much is outstanding against their account and all sorts of things. So that's really worked well for those parents there. Some of them come in with a change on the counter at the office, which isn't ideal, but you know, someone in the office runs out and feeds it to the Compass School Manager for them. So that's a co-contribution model. I've had another school I was talking to last week that wants a co-contribution model. But to them, they see the risk as it's something that the risk is actually going to grow as the equipment ages. So when the brand new, shiny, pretty laptop arrives, the families are going to place a high value on it. They're going to be more prepared to pay for it than they are maybe in the third year when there's newer, prettier, shinier machines available elsewhere. So they wanted something that scaled and stepped down over a 3-year period. So in the first year, parents paid slightly more, drop down, so finally they're paying less, and that reduced the risk for the school. The school's payments were flat. Should go this way, because you're on the other side of the world. The school's payments were flat over time, but the parents paid more the beginning and step down. So the school was collecting a little bit of buffer over time to sort of cover any risk in the third year of that equipment. Is that sort of clear? Yeah. Does everyone's clear on the different types of leasing? Yeah. Flip. This is Will's slide.
I have a picture, is anyway. We'll try and have.
This is the equity,
yeah.
just sort of talking about the equity, and I've already mentioned that for families that are unable to participate in the program or unwilling to participate by paying for the program, the school sort of still has some obligation to provide access to IT. That comes back to it being a business decision. Leasing can be included in that, and some of the schools are approaching that by saying, well, 6% of our kids are going to sort of fall into this category based on our experience. So what we're going to do is we'll have an uplift on parent payments from the other parents to provide that buffer. And since most schools put an uplift on the actual lease payments to cover the infrastructure costs as well, that little bit of 6% across what might be 800 students ends up being maybe $10 per year extra for every parent to cover 6 to 8% of students that are unable to pay anything. But it, once again, comes back to a business decision. Does the school allow that child to take the device home or not? Or is it something accessed whilst on campus? Okay, so leasing, why do it? There's more than just cash flow associated with leasing, and this is just sort of a little bit about the actual total cost of leasing. So if you have purchased a $1,000 item today, you've paid $1,000 for it, end of story. If you lease it over a 3-year period, you're going to be paying, if it was a 0% finance offer, and at the moment you can get an effective interest rate of negative 1% or something like that, but let's say it was 0%, paying $83 per quarter for 12 quarters over 3 years if it were a 3-year lease. To bring that back so that you compare the $1,000 out of your pocket today to that sort of time value money of payments over 3 years, we do a net present value calculation. So I've done a net present value calculation of a 12 quarters, and it comes out to around about, let's say, the $850 mark. So the value of leasing is, if you just took the 12 payments and didn't do a net present value calculation, it's going to be $1,000, but you've got the benefit of the cash flow over time. If you then apply the net present value calculation, it's about $850. So that's the cost of money over time. Right? Is that clear? Does anyone? Yep.
Liz, in that example,
Yep.
that's based on, as you said, 0%. So you can do a lease that literally is a 0% lease over that period.
Over the minimum term of the lease. Now, and I'm going to talk about what I mean when I say over the minimum term of the lease, because this is where people get lost with leasing. You're not leasing specialists. This is something you do once a year, or it might be the first time you've ever done it with leasing. So there's all these traps that are found out there in the industry designed to lure people in and pay more than the minimum term cost. And so if you're only paying 12 payments, nothing more, yes, it's going to come up to, on a 0% option, the $1,000 that you originally would have had to outlay. But if you flick to the next slide and the slide after that, this was just an example of, there are some consumer finance deals out there in the market. This was just, I did a search, consumer finance, on the internet and came up with a company called RentSmart. I did the $1,000 in there, and the net present value of the consumer through RentSmart came out to about $1,700 on consumer finance. You can do GE money, which they say is a 0% option, but if you default a single payment, if you don't have the contract paid out in full before the lease ends, I think it's 2 weeks or a month prior to the actual contract end, they'll hit you with about 20% interest rate. So, shock horror. They say 0%, but you've got to understand the terms and conditions that you're recommending to a parent before they sign up for that. And the people, as I said, most likely to sign a consumer finance deal are the ones potentially least prepared to read the terms and conditions and understand them, and deal with the consequences of a default.
So Liz, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
This is the point I made this morning that you heard me make, and that is the financing that we've talked about so far. For a school buying a bunch of servers or a whole bunch of devices, you can get finance, we'll say from Liz, because we're here, you can provide finance which is 0%, and you're going to talk about the pits and falls, but you can provide 0%
Yeah.
finance, right?
Yeah.
But parents are not going to have access to 0% finance, are they?
Well, they will through GE money, but the pitfalls of that
Yeah.
opportunity are the
Right.
ones I spelled out before, and they are not included in the business contract.
Okay.
Yeah. So flip the screen.
Oh, isn't this a good
This is
picture?
well.
I've got to go on Tahiti. I like to sit out the back with the surfers. It was just my introduction to risk. So the next slide's risk, I think.
Yeah, you're falling off a fiscal wall or
Yeah,
something. I
fiscal
think.
wall.
I don't know. Okay, so leasing risks. And I've just spoken about consumer finance risks. Last year there was a company called First Tech, and I don't know if any of you heard about First Tech. They were in the media, but they were a computer reseller that also had a leasing model and portal, and everybody signed in. And there were several schools, they're West Australian based, but there were several Victorian schools that signed up to this, told their parents to go onto the First Tech site to pay for the goods or sign up for a lease for the goods, and whether they pay cash or lease those goods, they didn't receive them because First Tech went bust. And what we're talking about here is risk and how a school needs to, I guess, mitigate risk by, if you're going to make a recommendation like that, you don't want to make a recommendation to a company that's going to fall over. Because who's liable? And in that case, the education department had to pick up the bill because the school had made the recommendation to the parents to do this, and the parents just did what they were told. So there's liabilities and risks, and we do want the schools to be protected, depending, regardless of any choices the school makes to pay cash, or to have the parents pay cash or otherwise. Next slide. Okay, so I don't know if anyone else watches the checkout, but I'm quite a fan. It's the Chaser team, they do a bit of a thing. If I could say one thing, which is my big warning, if you're going to choose a lessor, don't make the selection based on the best rate alone. The best rate could actually be the most expensive lease out there, because there's a whole heap of questions you need to ask in association with that best rate. So you might get the two best rates and then go out and ask all these questions. And here are the questions, and I'll hand out these questions. They're all on a bit of a piece of paper, so you don't have to write them down. With that tape on, hand it on. Next page. Questions that you should ask. Yeah. Are there any documentation fees? So lots of financiers will have anywhere from a $250 to $450 documentation fee for every lease. So if you get $10,000 worth of equipment this week and another $25 next month, they're going to charge it to you every time. Next. Will I pay per diem rentals? And how are they determined? Does anyone know what a per diem rental is?
Something about day.
Yeah. It's a daily rental. Now, if you sign up for a monthly lease, most financiers are going to say that the first day of the lease agreement will be the first day of the month after you signed the contract. And that's when the 12 or the 36 months of a 3-year lease is going to start. If it's a quarterly lease, the first day of the lease is going to be the first day of the next quarter. So the 1st of January, 1st of April, 1st of July, so on and so forth. But you've signed your contract, for instance, on the 15th of February, and you've got a quarterly lease. Well, the next quarter doesn't start till the 1st of April, so you've got 45 days before your lease really actually starts. So you'll pay 45 days of per diem rentals on top of those 12 quarterly rentals, or if it were a monthly, 15 days of per diem on top of the 36 monthly rentals. Now, why is that important? Is that total cost of leasing that I talked about before is 0% based on 12 payments or 36 payments, not 12 and a half quarters or 36 and a half months. So you add another 45 days on and you're now at 5% effective interest rate. Makes a massive difference.
Liz, can you, when you sign a lease agreement, can you say to whoever you get it from, the equipment's arriving from Dell on the 28th of January?
Yep.
That's when I want it to start.
Can you say that to me, or I say that to you?
I'm the customer. Can I say that to you?
If you said that to me and you want it to start on the 28th of January,
Yep.
if you were paying monthly, your actual lease starts on the 1st of February.
Why? That's not when I want the money. I want it to start from
We
the 28th.
invoice on the 1st of every month
Why?
because that's the way banks are.
Gee.
Can you
Okay.
then make sure that they're not shipped until the first of the month, so we don't have any
Well,
problems?
actually, don't jump ahead of me.
Sorry.
What I'm going to tell you is those per diem rentals, you don't have to pay a cent with us,
Oh.
okay? Because you're in total control. And so this next question, the bracket, how are they determined? If you're going to pay a per diem rental, who determines how many you pay? Is it going to be you or is it going to be the finance company? And so if you're leasing with DFS, it's going to be you. You determine by signing the contract for a particular date. So if you want to start your lease on the 1st of February, you sign it on the last business day before the 1st of February. We start the lease when you sign the contract because your signing the contract tells me I have to pay all your invoices. So I've paid for everything and I'm not receiving an income for 45 days. Well, I'm not going to pay until I'm going to receive an income for it. So you hold the contracts, keep them nice and tight. You don't have to have your suppliers paid until you determine that you should pay them. And that's how you control it. Paying monthly is always a good thing, but with our lease contracts, it's not necessary, and I'll go into why that is. Go on to the next question. Those first two questions are the questions that impact the commencement of a lease and the cost that you might incur at the commencement of the lease. This next question determines costs that you might incur at the end of the lease. A lot of people, they sign a lease and they kind of forget what's going to happen 3 years from now. So what are your obligations at the end of the lease? Most finance companies want some sort of notice that you intend to return the goods. They might ask for that notice 90 days prior or 120 days prior, or in our case it's 30 days prior. But if you don't notify, what's the default going to be? It's going to be 90 days, which is another whole quarter. That was 5%, remember? Or is it going to be something else? In our case, it's only 30 days if you don't, and quite often we're quite happy to waive that if the goods have come back on time. So the default for a missed notification for us is a month, but most of the industry is 90 days. There are some out there that do 120 days. Default extension for non-return of goods. So if you need those goods for an extra month because, let's say we're not talking laptops and we're talking server and you've got a server refresh but the equipment's been delayed, it's sitting on the docks with customs and it's not getting through. You need your existing equipment for 1 more month. You only pay 1 more month rental as opposed to, the industry standard is an extra 90 days, 5%, tick, tick, tick. Not good. Return location. If you've rented this equipment, which is what we're talking about, this only applies to rental agreements, you need to return the goods. So where are you going to return it to? Just knowing that that is within your state is something that you want to do. And obviously we return to Campbellfield here in Victoria. And is there an all but not less than all requirement? And what I mean by an all but not less than all is if you had a schedule, had multiple different devices on it, but you only wanted to return, say, 50% of those devices because you needed the other 50% for another month or so, if it has that clause in it, you're going to pay 100% rental until everything's been returned and finished off. So it's a hidden gotcha. I don't have it in my contract like that. It's just something to be aware of that you don't want to be exposed to. All these questions are on a bit of paper. Flick the page. So here's the Dell Finance response, which is the sort of thing that you want. And the next page is the industry average. You can see documentation fees, $250 or more. The interim may be determined by the date of the invoice. If there were multiple invoices, the oldest invoice, and you don't have control over it. And when I was saying the 30 days, it's actually $83 per thousand for 90 days. It's a bit of a typo there, compared to $17 for DFS. So look, it's just a bit of an example of where some costs can creep up. I mean, leasing is basically a very good thing as long as you know what you're committing to. You know, I'm not here to scare you off leasing. I'm just here to sort of say, be armed with all of the right things to make sure that the leasing works for you, not against you. Does anyone have any questions about everything I've been walking through? We'll go to the next page if you like. You know, because we've got 5 minutes left if you've got questions. Yeah?
Does it have to be Dell equipment?
No, any equipment at all. A lot of our schools, well, I'll say Belmont High School last year, as much as they wanted to buy the Dell product, they couldn't on a cost basis, but they leased it.
So you can choose your own supplier?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yeah. I'm not here to, you know, really you choose your supplier, you determine your equipment. As much as, you know, I want to tell you that Dell's going to be the best product for you, you've ultimately got to determine what's going to fit with your school, and part of that is the cash equation and what's going to be affordable.
Surprisingly, we're completely independent of one another. So
Yes.
you can do financing for any equipment,
That's
and I don't get any benefit from whether Liz provides finance or not. So I've got no push for finance, and it's excellent service, and clearly the figures show. We'd like to think DFS is much better than your opposition, but it doesn't make any difference to me whether you finance or not. I don't get paid anything more or less whether you finance.
Yeah. It's really a service that Dell provides to ensure that Dell customers are going to be protected and always have the best solution if they choose to use the Dell Finance. So, but yes, you know, I just pay invoices.
Got another question. With
Yeah.
when you say 0% finance,
What does
that
that
can't
mean?
be real 0% finance. Otherwise, how do you make money?
The first
Okay,
question I asked
so-
Liz when we discussed
Yeah,
this.
yeah. I'm
As
happy
one of
to-
those boring accounting teachers, I'm
No,
fascinated
no,
with the
no.
answer.
Yeah, so this applies to the rental only, not to a finance lease where you own the goods at the end. So in a rental over 3 years, and I should couch that 0% based on a 3-year lease with quarterly payments, my assumption is that the goods are going to come back to me. And we own our warehouses. All the equipment comes back to our warehouse where we test, inspect, we remove any identifying labels, and we say, buyers that we have all over the world, we've got a load of equipment, and they come to us because they know the equipment we have is of a particular quality. They love our Dell equipment. In fact, Dell equipment is valued more highly than anything in the secondary market because it is robust and it does survive well after a 3-year usage period, even in a school. So we actually take the value associated with the value of that equipment at the end of the lease, and we make that part of that equation. So the 5, as an accounting teacher, when you're calculating a lease, there are 5 components. There is the term of the lease, the frequency of the payments, an interest rate which in a rental we don't disclose to you, a residual value that we don't disclose to you, and then you solve for that payment. So those 2 moving parts, the interest rate and the residual value, bring that cost down for you. So as long as we know that equipment's coming back, you're going to get the best outcome.
So can I ask you to follow up
Yeah,
with
sure.
that, because I think it's more relevant. So when we return,
Yes,
what's the agreement regarding
condition.
state of return?
That's right. So fair wear and tear is fine, and I was just about to launch into my next thing there. One of the really amazing things about the Dell products is Dell Pro Support. Dell Pro Support, you can have your equipment repaired so that it's in good condition before you send it back under Pro Support. And all of the leasing customers, I recommend, if you've got a rental agreement, you get Pro Support. It's not just that the kids don't have as much downtime if something happens to their equipment. It's that repair of the goods prior to you sending it back. Have a full warranty repair and a Pro Support repair. Just get all the equipment in at the end of the term, and you say, "Tex, out here, fix everything," and then you send it back. No, it's not an additional cost, but yeah, it is a little bit of extra time spent at the end, but there's a high value associated with that.
Is this the tidal wave of information that you've went out?
No.
Give us
All overwhelmed, I'm sure.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah, of
Are
course.
is Dell an approved, Dell Financial Services, are they one of the approved debt suppliers? You know?
Debt only has one relationship, and that's with Capital Finance. Capital Finance is up for sale, so you don't even know what the future of that company is. They're up for sale. The other one that's up for sale is All Leasing. So you don't know who you're actually leasing with if you lease with either of those companies, because you don't know who's going to buy them. So once again, those terms and conditions may be executed to the limit of what is allowable within the contract, depending on who purchases one of those companies. So, you know, my suggestion is that you stick with your vendor financiers or your banks, not with the independent financiers, because independent financiers come and go.
And you can lease a principal's car as well, can't you? Can't you?
Leasing what? The next slide. You know, it's not just desktops. Schools can lease anything, and it can all go under a single agreement. You have a master contract, you can have lease schedules for different equipment. The question is, you know, we can lease any product. Is there a business case to lease it? The business case is cash flow and the life cycle. You know, clearly with laptops and desktops, there's a really good argument for leasing because it can be cheaper than the cost of purchasing. But the other argument is cash flow. So, 3D printers even, you can lease those. But yes, you can engage with me at any time. My contact details are on that piece of paper, or you can get a card to me if you choose. But if you've got an existing lease and you're curious as to how you're impacted by that, I'm happy to sort of walk through and help you to understand what the implications are of the existing leases you have. But otherwise, yeah, choose to lease. Choose me. So